She was a black woman in a white dress she never wanted to wear, standing in a courthouse room that smelled like recycled air and broken choices, signing her name next to a man she had never met, a man who ran the most feared criminal organization on the East Coast, a man the underground called the Throne. And he was watching her from a wheelchair. Celeste Beaumont did not choose this. She did not choose the debt her father built in secret, did not choose the men who appeared at their Brooklyn apartment with an envelope and a number so large it made the air leave her lungs. $280,000. She did not choose the wedding dress, the cold conference room, the fluorescent lights, the signed papers, or the Manhattan penthouse that became her gilded prison overnight. What she chose was to survive it with her dignity intact. But Jang Hyun-soo, the Korean Mafia boss with dragon tattoos rising up his neck, the man who governed an empire of fear from a chair no one was supposed to notice, he had a plan, and that plan had her name on it. He was going to use her as bait. He was going to put her in a window and let his enemies see her, while he moved his pieces around her like she was something to be calculated instead of protected. What he never imagined was that she would find out. And what neither of them imagined was what would happen in the silence after she confronted him, after she said the words he had never let anyone say to his face, after she knelt on the cold floor of his fortress and refused to look away from the one thing he had spent 2 years hiding from the world. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. The city never asked permission before swallowing people whole. That was the first thing Celeste Beaumont had learned about New York. Not in school, not from a book, but from watching it happen to her father over the course of 12 quiet, unremarkable years. One morning, Desmond Beaumont was a man with a briefcase and a plan. And then, without any single dramatic moment to point to, he simply wasn't anymore. She had tried to paint it once. The disappearance of a man who was still physically present. She'd used grays and deep ochres, the colors of things that had once been warm and were cooling. The canvas sat against the wall of the small Brooklyn apartment they shared, turned backward, because Desmond had walked past it one evening and his hands had started shaking. And she'd never been able to look at it straight on again. That was the kind of love that destroyed you slowly. The kind that made you carry someone else's weight until your spine curved under it, and you called the curvature loyalty. She was thinking about that painting on the night the two men came. She hadn't been asleep. She rarely slept well, a fact she'd inherited from her father, along with his gap-toothed smile and his embarrassing habit of humming while he read. She was sitting cross-legged on the kitchen counter with a cold cup of chamomile, sketching nothing in particular in the margin of an old receipt, when she heard the knock. Not the knock of neighbors or delivery men. A knock with a specific weight behind it. The kind of knock that already knows the door will open. She heard her father's footsteps. Careful, slow. The shuffle of a man who had been expecting this and had been praying against it simultaneously. She heard the door. She heard voices she did not recognize. And then she heard a number. $280,000. The pencil stopped moving. She got down from the counter without making a sound. Bare feet on cold linoleum. She pressed herself against the wall beside the hallway, and she listened, and what she heard remade the architecture of her entire evening. Her entire life, actually, though she didn't know that yet. The two men spoke with the efficiency of people who had done this before. Not cruel, not kind, simply transactional, The way a doctor sounds when explaining a diagnosis that does not personally affect him. There was a debt. The debt was overdue by a considerable measure. The man to whom the debt was owed had made a decision about how it would be repaid. That was when she heard her own name. She stepped into the hallway before she'd consciously decided to. Desmond was in the armchair, the old green one that had been old when she was a child, and he looked up at her with an expression she had no language for. It was not quite shame. It was something that lived beneath shame, in the place where shame goes when a person has already exhausted it completely. The two men turned to look at her. They did not look surprised. That, more than anything, made her skin go cold. One of them placed an envelope on the coffee table. White. Unmarked except for a name typed in clean black letters. Jang Hyun-soo. "Who is this?" she asked. "Your husband," the taller man said, without inflection, as though he were reading from a document. "Effective 3 weeks from today. The ceremony details are inside. Once the marriage is registered, the debt disappears. If you do not appear..." "I understand what happens if I don't appear," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. She picked up the envelope. She did not look at her father. She could not yet. Because if she looked at him, she would see in his eyes the thing she was most afraid of. That he had known this was coming. That some part of him had calculated it and let it happen. And she did not have enough strength in that particular moment to survive that knowledge. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed. She opened the envelope. There was a photograph, not a personal one, something that looked like it had been pulled from a newspaper or a surveillance file. She couldn't tell. A man at a table in what appeared to be a restaurant. Dark suit, broad shoulders, a face that was almost architectural in its severity. He was seated. In every image, across the 3 photographs inside the envelope, he was seated. She noted it the way she noted everything, as an artist, cataloging light and composition and what a posture tells you about a person's relationship to the space they occupy. He occupied space like he owned it. Like he was the one who had chosen to sit and could stand at any moment if the mood struck him. Little did she know, as she studied those photographs in the amber light of her Brooklyn bedroom, that the man looking back at her from the page had not stood in over 2 years. That the stillness she read as authority was also armor. That Jang Hyun-soo, the man the criminal underground called the Throne, had built an entire mythology around a body that had betrayed him. And that the secret he guarded more fiercely than any fortune, more carefully than any weapon, was the simple, devastating truth that he could no longer walk. She slept 3 hours. In the morning, she went to the gallery, because she did not know what else to do with herself, and she moved paintings from one wall to another and told a customer that the piece he liked was acrylic on linen and watched him nod as though that meant something to him. Her manager, a small Italian woman named Rosa, who had known her since she was 19, looked at her across the gallery floor and said nothing. Rosa had a gift for recognizing the faces of people who had received news they hadn't finished processing yet. That afternoon, she bought the dress. She had decided, walking to the bridal shop on Atlantic Avenue, that she would not be defeated in the details. She would not arrive at this thing in borrowed beauty or someone else's vision of what a bride should look like. She chose the simplest gown they had. Off-white, clean-cut, no lace, no beading, nothing that required anyone else's approval to be elegant. It fit her the way good things fit her, as though it had been waiting. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Not with vanity, with the quiet, forensic attention of someone who is trying to memorize the last version of themselves before a change they cannot stop. The sales associate asked if she was excited. "I'm getting married," Celeste said, which was not an answer, but it was the only true thing she could offer. That night, she sat across from her father at the kitchen table, and they ate rice and beans and said almost nothing. Desmond's hands wrapped around his fork the way they always did when he was fighting the urge to apologize. Compulsively, uselessly, in circles. She watched him and felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief. It was something older and more patient than either. The love that had brought her to this table, to this apartment, to this envelope, to this dress. The love that was going to walk her down the aisle of a courthouse and hand her to a stranger. "Celeste," he started. "Don't," she said gently. "Not tonight." He nodded. His eyes were wet. She did not look away from them, because she had decided in the bridal shop that she was done looking away from hard things. Whatever was coming, she would look at it directly. 3 weeks passed the way weeks pass when you are dreading something, in a series of ordinary moments that feel simultaneously endless and alarmingly fast. She painted, she worked, she called her college friend Tanya and didn't tell her anything. She researched the name Jang Hyun-soo online at 2 a.m, sitting in the dark with the screen's light on her face, and found articles that were careful and vague in the way that journalism about powerful, dangerous men tends to be. Never accusing, always implying. References to businesses that seemed legitimate on paper. References to incidents that were never fully explained. References to his name spoken alongside words like network and influence, and in one old piece she found, translated from a Korean outlet, a single phrase that stopped her cold. The man who made the East Side obey by sitting very, very still. She closed the laptop. The morning of the wedding, she pinned her veil to one side with a small pearl clip that had belonged to her grandmother. She did not eat breakfast. She put on the dress alone in her bedroom while her father waited in the hallway. She could hear him breathing through the door, those careful, shameful breaths, and she looked at herself one final time in the mirror. She did not look like a woman being sacrificed. She looked, she decided, like a woman walking into something she had not yet finished understanding. Which, she would later realize, was exactly what was happening. The courthouse was on Center Street, and it smelled like every public building in Manhattan smelled, like recycled air and old decisions, and the particular exhaustion of a city that processes human suffering at scale and calls it bureaucracy. Celeste walked in behind one of the 2 men who had come to the apartment, the taller one, whose name she had not been given and had not asked for. And she kept her eyes forward and her breathing measured, because she had learned somewhere between the bridal shop and this moment that the only way through a thing you cannot escape is to move through it with your whole body, deliberately, as though you chose it. The room they led her to was not a chapel. It was a conference room on the 4th floor with fluorescent lighting and a rectangular table and windows that looked out onto nothing in particular. There were 4 men in dark suits standing against the walls like furniture that had learned to breathe. There was a man she recognized from nothing, a judge, presumably, or someone performing the function of one, standing at the far end with a folder in his hands and an expression of practiced neutrality. There was Desmond, already seated in one of the chairs along the wall, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere between the floor and the middle distance. And there, at the head of the table, was Jang Hyun-soo. She had studied the photographs. She had thought she was prepared for the reality. She was not. The photographs had captured the architecture of him, the broad frame, the severe face, the quality of stillness, but they had not captured the atmosphere he generated. The room organized itself around him the way iron filings organize themselves around a magnet. Not because anyone told them to, but because physics demanded it. His suit was black and immaculate. His collar was open. The gold watch caught the fluorescent light and held it. His hands rested on the arms of the wheelchair with the casual authority of a man resting his hands on a throne, which, she remembered from the article, was precisely the point. He was looking at her when she entered. He had been looking at the door, she suspected, since before she walked through it. Those dark, unblinking eyes moved over her with no particular hurry, the way a person surveys something they intend to understand completely before committing to an opinion. She met his gaze and did not look away. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the set of his jaw. "You came," he said. His voice was low, quiet in the specific way that very loud things are quiet when they are choosing not to be loud. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "Everyone has a choice." A pause. Those eyes moved briefly to Desmond, then back to her. "You chose him." She had no answer for that, because it was true, and they both knew it. And acknowledging it aloud would have required a kind of grief she was not willing to perform in front of strangers. So she said nothing. She walked to the table. She stood where the taller man indicated she should stand. She listened to words she did not fully absorb. She signed where she was told to sign. And just like that, in a room that smelled like recycled air and old decisions, Celeste Beaumont became Mrs. Jang. Little did she know, as she pressed pen to paper, that the man sitting 4 feet away from her had not wanted this any more than she had. That the marriage had been his lawyer's idea, a way to establish a domestic anchor, a layer of legitimacy over his operations. A woman whose presence in his apartment could explain certain financial structures to anyone who came asking questions. He had agreed to it with the same detached efficiency with which he agreed to most things that served a purpose. He had not expected her to walk in wearing that dress, with that posture, and look at him like she was trying to decide whether he was worth the trouble of being afraid of. He had not expected to find that interesting. The car that took them to the penthouse was black and silent and moved through Manhattan traffic with the ease of something that the city had agreed to accommodate. Celeste sat on one side, Hyun-soo on the other, and the distance between them on the leather seat felt both enormous and irrelevant. She watched the city out the window. He watched her watch it. "You paint," he said. She turned. "How do you know that?" "I know most things about the people who enter my life." Not threatening, just factual. "Acrylic mostly, cityscapes. You sold 3 pieces in the last 6 months through the gallery on Bergen Street." Is that supposed to impress me or frighten me? He considered this with what appeared to be genuine thought. "Neither. I simply prefer knowing who I'm dealing with." "And who am I dealing with?" she asked. He turned to look out his own window. The skyline rose around them, indifferent and enormous. "Someone who keeps his word," he said. "That is more than most people can say." The penthouse was the kind of space that makes you understand, for the first time, the difference between wealth and money. It wasn't the size, though it was vast. It wasn't the view, though the view was the whole of the city spread below like a circuit board with the lights still on. It was the quality of the silence, thick and deliberate, the silence of a place that had been designed to contain a particular kind of person. The furniture was minimal and dark. There were no photographs. There was art on the walls. Not decorative art, not the kind bought to fill space, but pieces that had been selected with the cold precision of someone who understood what images were capable of doing to a room. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly, taking inventory. "Your room is the second on the left," one of the suited men said, appearing from somewhere she hadn't noticed. "Meals are at 7 and 8 in the evening. If you need—" "I'll figure it out," she said. The man looked at Hyun-soo. Hyun-soo made the smallest possible gesture with 2 fingers. The man left. She explored the penthouse the way she had learned to explore everything. Slowly, systematically, with her hands behind her back so she wouldn't be tempted to touch things that weren't hers. She opened doors. She found the kitchen, enormous and barely used. She found a library with books she recognized and books in Korean she couldn't read. She found a hallway that led to a series of rooms, and at the end of it, one door that was locked. She found the room with a light. It was not locked. It was simply empty. A large square room with north-facing windows that went from floor to ceiling, and through those windows, the city at midday was a wash of silver and gray and blue that fell across the bare hardwood floor like something poured. She stood in it for a long moment. An artist's light. The kind of light that galleries spend fortunes trying to replicate artificially. She did not ask permission. That night, while Hyun-soo ate dinner in the long dining room with 2 of his men and conducted the low, precise conversations that she was neither invited to join nor excluded from, she went back to that room. She had nothing with her. No canvas, no brushes. She sat on the floor in the light that the city made at night, which was a different thing entirely, amber and fractured and alive. And she pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and thought, this room is the only honest thing in this apartment. The next morning, she asked the tall man, his name she had learned was Jun-so, if she could have someone bring things from her apartment. Jun-so looked at her for a moment and then nodded, and by afternoon, there was a stack of canvases against the wall of the light room and a box of her supplies on the floor. And she stood over them with something that was not quite happiness, but was closer to it than anything she'd felt in weeks. She worked. She painted the view she could see from those north windows, the skyline doing what it did at different hours, the way it changed completely depending on the weather and the angle of the sun. The first piece was rough and honest and not very good, because her hands were still tight with everything she hadn't said. But it was something. On the 4th day, she heard the sound of wheels on hardwood. She did not turn immediately. She finished the brushstroke she was in the middle of, a sweep of gray-blue across the upper third of the canvas, and then she set the brush down and turned. And Hyun-soo was in the doorway. He had come alone. No Jun-so, no suited men. Just him, in a white shirt this time, watching her with that expression she was beginning to recognize as his default state. Complete and total attention, with nothing given away. He looked at the canvas for a long time. "What is it?" he said. "The view from here?" she said. "What you see every day without having to climb stairs?" She had not planned to say that. The words had arrived in her mouth fully formed, and she had simply let them out. And the moment they were in the air, she felt the specific quality of silence that follows something that can't be taken back. She watched his face for anger. She found something else. A flicker, barely visible, there and gone in the region of his eyes. Not pain exactly, something adjacent to it. Something that a person carries when they have taught themselves not to register pain, and the lesson is so well learned, it takes them a moment to identify what they're feeling. "It's honest," he said finally. "I don't know how to be anything else." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. The way he had in the courthouse, but differently. Because they were alone now, and there was no performance required of either of them. "That," he said quietly, "is either very useful or very dangerous. In my experience, it is usually both." He left without another word. But that evening, for the first time since she had arrived, there was a second chair at the dining table. She sat down across from him. Jinso poured water for both of them. The two other men at the table went carefully quiet. And Celeste picked up her fork, and Hyunsu picked up his. And they ate in silence that was, for the first time, not entirely hostile. Little did either of them know, in that careful quiet, that something had already begun. Something neither of them had a name for yet, and neither would have welcomed if they had. The kind of thing that starts so quietly it looks like nothing at all, until the day you realize it has been growing the whole time, down in the dark, sending roots through everything. And by then, it is far too late to stop it. It is always too late, by the time you notice those things. That is how they get you. The nights were when the penthouse told the truth about itself. During the day, it was a functioning place. Men came and went, phones rang in rooms she wasn't invited into. Junso moved through the hallways with the quiet efficiency of someone whose entire purpose was to ensure that the machinery of Hyunsu's world kept turning without visible friction. During the day, the penthouse performed normalcy the way a very good actor performs emotion. Convincingly enough that you almost forgot it was a performance. But at night, the men left, and the phones stopped, and the city below settled into its nocturnal frequency, and the penthouse became simply a very large, very quiet space, with two people inside it who had not chosen each other and did not know what to do with that fact. She started hearing him at night. Not voices. He was not a man who spoke to himself. She had already understood that about him. But sounds. The specific sound of wheels on hardwood at 2 a.m, moving from one end of the apartment to the other. The sound of a glass being set down in the kitchen. Once, the sound of something that might have been a book thrown against a wall. Followed by a silence so complete, she found herself holding her breath until it ended. On the 8th night, she got up. She told herself she was going for water. She was not going for water. She moved through the dark hallway in her socks and her paint-stained sleep shirt and found him in the library. Not reading, just sitting in front of the dark window with a glass of something amber in his hand and the lights off. The city doing its illuminated business behind the glass at his back. He did not turn when she entered. "You should be asleep." "So should you." A pause. "I don't sleep well." "Neither do I." She leaned against the doorframe. "I inherited it from my father, along with a gap in my front teeth and a completely impractical love of a medium that doesn't pay." Something changed in the set of his shoulders. Not softening exactly. She was learning that Jung Hyun-soo did not soften structurally the way other people did. But a kind of density left the room. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. She sat. Not across from him. There was no chair across from him, but in the armchair at an angle to his position, so that they were both facing the window, both watching the city, neither required to look directly at the other. It was, she realized, probably the most comfortable she had felt in his presence since the courthouse, and the reason was the geometry of it. Side by side was easier than face to face, less like a confrontation, more like two people who happened to be occupying the same view. They sat in silence for a while. It was not the silence of the first dinner. That had been cautious, armored silence, the silence of people deciding whether the other was a threat. This was something different, quieter in the right way. "The tattoos," she said eventually. "On your neck. What do they mean?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "The first one," he said, "I got when I was 19. A dragon. My father had the same one. His father before him." A pause. "Where I come from, certain things are inherited whether you choose them or not." She understood that completely. She did not say so, but something in the quality of her silence must have communicated it, because he glanced at her sideways, a brief, assessing look, and then returned his gaze to the window. "The others?" she asked. "Additions. Over time. Each one marks something." His jaw tightened slightly. Decisions, losses, things that required permanence. "Like a painting," she said. "You don't paint over things that need to be remembered." This time the look he gave her lasted longer. "Yes," he said, and the word sounded like it surprised him slightly. "Like that." They sat until nearly 4 in the morning. They spoke, in fragments, about things that were and were not about themselves. About the city, about the nature of debts, about what it meant to be obligated to something larger than your own preferences. She told him about the canvas she'd turned against the wall, the one painted in gray and ochre. He listened with the quality of attention that she was learning was native to him. Complete, uninterrupted, as though nothing she said was irrelevant. He did not tell her about the night the bullet found his spine. But he told her in the careful, oblique language of a man who has rehearsed not talking about something for so long that the rehearsal shows, that there were people in his world who were waiting for him to reveal a weakness, that he had spent 2 years ensuring they saw nothing they could use. "And has it worked?" she asked. "So far," he said. Then quieter. "Most days." She went back to bed at 4 and did not sleep until 6. And when she finally did sleep, it was deeply and without the usual architecture of anxiety. Something had shifted. She didn't examine it. Examining things too early disturbed them. The following week, she began to learn the rhythms of the household in the way that a person learns a new city. Not by studying a map, but by moving through it until the geography becomes instinct. She learned that Hyun-soo worked from 7 until noon without interruption, and that during those hours the apartment was effectively his alone, and she existed in the light room with her canvases and was left in peace. She learned that Jun-soo was not unkind, simply careful. A man who had calculated that the least risky version of every interaction was also the most efficient one. She learned that the locked door at the end of the hallway was a room that had been used for physical therapy, briefly 2 years ago, and then locked when he stopped going. She did not ask about the locked room directly, but she painted the hallway. Not the locked door, just the hallway. The quality of light at the end of it. The way the shadow fell at a particular angle in the afternoon. The feeling of something that was not quite a dead end, but was not quite an opening either. Hyun-soo saw it one evening when she had left it propped against the kitchen counter to dry. And he looked at it for a long time without saying anything. And then he moved past it without comment, and Jin-soo, passing behind him, met her eyes with an expression that was as close to impressed as Jin-soo's face apparently got. The nights in the library became a pattern. Not every night. Some nights he was not there, and on those nights she went back to bed without looking for him, because she had decided early that she would not pursue anything in this arrangement that she hadn't been offered. But most nights he was there, and she was there, and the city was there between them through the dark glass, and they talked. She learned that he had come to New York at 22 with nothing except a name that meant something in certain circles, and an understanding of how power worked that most people spent their whole lives failing to acquire. She learned that he had a brother in Seoul who did not know the full truth of what his older sibling had become, and that this was a deliberate protection. The one person in Hyun-soo's life whose safety depended on his ignorance. She learned that he had read more novels than she expected, and that he had opinions about them that were specific and sometimes startling in their perceptiveness. She told him about her mother, who had died when Celeste was 11, and left a particular quality of silence in the apartment that Desmond had never quite managed to fill. She told him that she had started painting because of that silence, because she needed to put something into the space where a person used to be, and words had felt insufficient. "Do you miss her?" he asked one night. "Every day," she said. "Less like losing and more like carrying. She's still there, just differently shaped." He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what that's like," he said. "The people I've lost, I cut them out. There's a difference between missing someone and keeping something dangerous inside you because you can't bring yourself to remove it." "Yes," she said. "There is. But sometimes the dangerous thing is also the most alive thing you have left." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the cold assessment, not the careful control. Something raw and briefly unguarded, there for 3 seconds before the door closed over it. That was the night she understood that Jang Hyun-soo was not what she had expected. He was not simple. He was not a monster, though he had certainly done monstrous things. She was not naive enough to set that aside entirely. He was a man who had built a fortress out of his own damage and then gotten so good at living inside it that he had confused the fortress for himself. She knew that confusion. She had inherited it, like the insomnia and the gap in her teeth, from a man who had sat in a green armchair and let the world make decisions about his daughter because he loved her too much and trusted himself too little. The difference was that Desmond had let the fortress crumble. Hyun-soo had reinforced his every day for 34 years. She was thinking about this, about fortresses, about inheritance, about the specific shape of things people build around their soft centers, when Jun-soo appeared in the doorway of the light room on a Tuesday afternoon and told her, with the measured calm that characterized all of his communications, that someone named Victor had been seen near the building. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Hyun-soo was at the other end of the apartment. She heard the quality of the silence that followed the name. A different silence from all the others she had cataloged in this place. Sharper, with an edge. "Who is Victor?" she asked Jun-soo. Jun-soo looked at her for a moment with those careful, calculating eyes. "Someone who should be dead," he said. And then he walked away, and she stood in her light room with a brush in her hand and paint drying on the canvas. And she understood, with the cold certainty of someone who has been watching the weather change for days, that the stillness was ending. That night, Hyun-soo did not come to the library. She sat there alone until 2 a.m, watching the city. And she noticed for the first time that the light from below, seen from up here, looked exactly like the moment just before a fire takes hold. That suspended, luminous instant when everything is about to change, and nothing has quite changed yet, and the only honest thing you can do is watch. She watched. Little did she know that in a room 3 floors below, Victor Rask, former lieutenant, former trusted man, the person who had placed a bullet in Jang Hyun-soo's spine at a restaurant in Koreatown on a Wednesday night 2 years ago. The person who had walked away and rebuilt himself in the gap left by his former leader's supposed decline, was mapping the layout of the penthouse from a photograph taken by someone on the inside. Little did she know that her name was on the page in his hand, and that Hyun-soo, at the other end of the apartment, was sitting with that knowledge and making a calculation that he would later, in the cold aftermath of what was coming, realize was the first calculation he had ever made that put someone else's survival above the survival of his own legend. The fire was already taking hold. None of them were watching the right thing. She found out about the plan by accident, the way the most important things tend to be found. Not through searching, but through being in the wrong place with the wrong quality of attention. It was a Thursday morning, 4 days after Jun-soo had said Victor's name in her light room like a verdict. She had been living inside a specific kind of tension since then. the tension of a household that was pretending nothing had changed while changing completely. More men in the hallways, conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Hyun-soo at dinner, present but elsewhere, his eyes doing the calculations she couldn't read, while his hands remained perfectly still on the table. She had been painting through it the way she painted through everything. The canvases were getting darker. She didn't try to correct it. On Thursday morning, she went to the kitchen early, before 7, before the household fully woke, and she heard voices from the room adjacent to the library, a room she had understood to be used for calls that required privacy. The door was not fully closed. She was not trying to listen, but the acoustics of the penthouse were what they were, and the voice she heard was Junso's, and the name she heard was her own. She stopped. She'll be in the light room at 4. Victor's men know the layout. If she's visible from the north windows at that hour. She did not hear the rest. A chair moved. She walked back to the kitchen with precise, careful steps and stood over the counter and gripped the edge of it with both hands and breathed. A bait. She was going to be used as bait. She stood there for a long time. Long enough for the city outside to shift from early gray to full morning. Long enough to move through the first wave of rage, which was enormous and white-hot, and arrive on the other side of it at something colder and more useful. She thought about what Hyun-soo had said in the library. I simply prefer knowing who I'm dealing with. She thought about the way he had looked at her hallway painting, and the way he had said, yes, like that, with the surprise of a man who had not expected to be understood. She thought about the locked door at the end of the hall. She thought about a bullet in a spine and 2 years of rebuilding a mythology around a body that had stopped cooperating. She thought, he is afraid. Not of Victor, of what Victor's attack would reveal. That the throne could not stand, literally and permanently, and that in the moment of crisis, the man all of them feared would be a man in a wheelchair, and the entire architecture of power he had constructed over 2 years would splinter at the base. He was going to use her as the distraction so that Victor's focus would be on her, on the visible, exposed, unprotected wife in the north window, while Hyun-soo's men positioned themselves. She was a variable he had calculated. A piece moved on a board. And the thing that she could not entirely hate, the thing that made the rage complicated, was that she understood it. She understood the logic of a man who had been betrayed once at close range and had spent every day since then ensuring that the perimeter of his vulnerability was as small as possible, even if making it small required making other people large targets. She understood it, and she was not going to allow it. She went to his office at 7:15, which was the one thing she had never done. His working hours were inviolable. Everyone in the household knew it. It was the clearest boundary in a place full of invisible ones. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting. He looked up from the desk with an expression that moved through surprise and arrived at something careful. You are going to use me, she said. Not an accusation. A fact, delivered with the flatness of someone who has already processed the emotion attached to it and is now simply reporting. The quality of silence in the room changed. He did not deny it. She watched him decide not to deny it, watched the small adjustment in his jaw that meant he was recalibrating. It would have kept you safe, he said. Hyun-soo. She said his name for the first time without the buffer of formality, and something moved through the room when she did. Both of them felt it. Neither acknowledged it. Being visible in a north window while Victor's men have the layout of this apartment is not being kept safe. That is being kept useful. You would have been protected. You destroyed me! The words came out with sudden force, unexpected even to her, and she felt the truth in them the way you feel a bruise when someone presses it. You destroyed the only choice I had left, which was to know what was being done with me. Do you understand that? I gave up everything to be here. I walked into this. The only thing I had left was the right to know what was happening in my own life, and you took that too. The silence after was profound. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face. Not in the courthouse, not in the library, not in any of the careful nocturnal hours they had spent watching the city together. Something exposed. Something that had not been visible before because the conditions for its visibility had not existed before this moment. "You're right," he said. She had not expected that. The simplicity of it. No qualification, no pivot, no redirection toward strategy or necessity. "I know," she said, quieter now. "I know why you did it. I even understand it. But I need you to hear that it was wrong." "I hear it," he said. And then, with the difficulty of a man saying something for the first time in a very long time, "I'm sorry." She looked at him across the desk. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. "Tell me the real plan," she said. "All of it. And then we decide together." He told her. Victor was coming that night. Not at 4, Junso had been speaking about a decoy arrangement, one that Hyun-soo had already decided against, but hadn't yet communicated to his men. The actual intelligence suggested Victor would move after midnight, when the building's external security shift changed, and there was a 4-minute window in the coverage. Victor had 3 men. He believed Hyun-soo's injury made him vulnerable to a direct approach. He believed, specifically, that a man who could not walk could not effectively defend a position without his full security apparatus around him. That belief, Hyun-soo said, was going to be Victor's last miscalculation. "And your men?" Celeste asked. "Positioned by 11. Victor won't see them until it's already done." "And me?" A pause. "I want you in the East Room, away from the windows. Door locked." "No," she said. "Celeste, I will not be locked in a room. I'm not furniture." She held his gaze. "I'll stay out of the way. I'll stay back. But I will not be locked away from what is happening in this place while you face it alone." A beat. "You came to me once, in the middle of the night, and talked about a bullet you never saw coming. You built everything you have around never being surprised again. I understand that. But you cannot build a life, and this is your life, Hyun-soo. This apartment, these people, me. You cannot build a life out of keeping every soft thing locked in a separate room." He was very still. The gold watch caught the light. His hands, on the desk, were perfectly composed, and she had learned enough about him by now to know that the more perfectly composed his hands were, the more it was costing him. "Stay back," he said finally. "Behind the kitchen threshold. You do not move forward regardless of what you hear." "Agreed," she said. She spent the rest of the day painting. It was not the north windows. It was a small canvas, almost square, and she painted the interior of the library at night. The dark window, the amber glass, 2 chairs at an angle to each other. The city behind the glass reduced to light. She painted it from memory and from something that was not quite memory, something that lived in the register below cognition, where the body records what the mind is still arguing about. She finished it at 9 in the evening. She ate. She changed out of the dress. She had worn it for the last time that morning, she understood, without ceremony, the way you understand the last of things when you're paying attention. She folded it carefully and put it on the shelf in her room and stood looking at it for a moment before she turned off the light. At 11:30, the building became very quiet in a particular way. She positioned herself at the kitchen threshold exactly as agreed, and she waited. And she listened to the city and to the silence inside it. And she thought about fortresses and the people who build them and the specific courage it takes to leave one door unlocked. At 12:47, she heard them come in. What followed happened quickly. She had been prepared for that by nothing, because nothing truly prepares you for the speed of real violence. Sounds she couldn't identify. A shout, brief and cut off. Breaking glass somewhere toward the front of the apartment. She pressed herself against the kitchen wall and breathed, and breathed, and breathed, and did not move, because she had given her word, and she understood, at the cellular level, that there are moments when the most powerful thing you can do is hold your position. And then silence. A long silence, with a particular texture of aftermath. And then the sound of wheels on hardwood, moving toward her. He came around the corner at the end of the hallway, and she saw immediately that his left arm was wrong. Held differently, the sleeve torn at the shoulder, dark with something she didn't want to name in the half-light. But he was upright in the chair, his spine straight, and his eyes, when they found her, were clear and present and entirely himself. She crossed to him before she decided to. She dropped to her knees in front of the chair, the hardwood floor cold through her thin clothing, and she took his arm in her hands and began to assess the damage, the way she had once watched a nurse assess her father's hands after an accident, with practical gentleness, with the concentration of someone who is refusing to let feeling interfere with function. He let her. He sat very still and let her, and she understood what that cost him. Not the pain, but the stillness, the allowing, the being tended to. "Victor?" she asked, without looking up from the wound. "Gone," he said. The word was final in the way that certain words are final. She worked in silence for a moment. Then, "Your men?" "Fine. All of them." She exhaled. Her hands kept moving. He watched her face with that total attention that she had stopped finding unnerving weeks ago, and had started finding, without quite meaning to, the most honest form of regard she had ever been offered. "Why did you come up the service ramp?" she asked. "Alone." A long pause. "Because you were here," he said. She looked up at him then. He looked back at her. The city did its luminous, indifferent work behind the windows. The apartment was quiet in the way that places are quiet after something irreversible has happened, and the air has absorbed it, and is simply holding it now, still and full. She had no answer for that. She didn't need one. She pressed her forehead briefly against his good shoulder. Not a collapse, not a performance of relief, just a contact, human and specific. And he did not move away. And after a moment, she felt his hand come up and rest against the back of her head with a carefulness that was almost terrible in its gentleness, as though he was touching something he had not expected to be allowed to touch, and was moving slowly so as not to frighten it away. They stayed like that for a moment that neither of them counted. Then she straightened and returned to the wound, and he returned to his stillness, and outside the city kept burning with all its borrowed light. 2 months passed in the way that good time passes. Not quickly, but fully, each day arriving with a completeness that the previous months had lacked. Desmond received an envelope with a deed inside it, and no signature, and he sat at his kitchen table with it for a long time, and then called his daughter, and she answered on the second ring. "Celeste," he said, and his voice cracked on both syllables. "I know, Dad," she said. "I know." "I'm sorry. I have been since the beginning. I was a coward and Dad." Her voice was quiet and certain. I know. And I need you to hear that I forgive you. Not because it was fine, but because I choose not to be destroyed by it. Do you understand the difference? He was crying. She could hear it.
Yes,
He managed.
yes, baby.
Good, she said. Come to dinner on Sunday. Bring your good jacket. She hung up and stood at the north window of the light room, looking at the city. And behind her, the room held 12 finished canvases and 3 in progress, and the smell of linseed oil, and the small square painting of 2 chairs that she had hung, without asking permission, on the library wall, where it had remained without comment for 7 weeks. She heard wheels on hard wood.
You hung it,
He said from the doorway. 3 weeks ago, she said without turning.
You didn't say anything.
No.
Did you want me to take it down?
A pause. No. She turned. He was in the doorway in his usual configuration. Black, contained, the watch catching the morning light. Those unblinking eyes doing their perpetual work of understanding everything in the room. But something in the overall arrangement of him was different. Looser, perhaps, by some fractional degree. The way a very tightly written piece of music sounds different when one note has been held a breath longer than written. Technically minor, experientially transformative. She had been painting him for a week without telling him. Not his face, his presence. The quality of space that organized itself around him. The way a room became a different room when he was in it. My father is coming to dinner Sunday, she said. He said nothing for a moment.
Tell Junso,
He said.
he'll need to know for the kitchen.
Not no. Not, this is not that kind of arrangement. Just, tell Junso. She smiled. It arrived on her face unannounced, as the real ones always did. Not performed, not managed, just there.
What are you painting?
He asked. She stepped aside so he could see the canvas. He moved into the room, into the light, and looked at it for a long time. It was the view again, but altered. The same skyline, the same fractured amber light, but the perspective had shifted entirely. Not from high above, looking down, from the floor, looking up. The buildings enormous and close and radiant, the sky between them the specific dark blue of something that is about to become morning. The view of someone who learned that the floor is not the end, she said. He looked at the painting for a long time. Then he looked at her. And Jang Hyun-soo, the man they called the Throne. The man who had governed an empire of fear from a chair, who had spent 2 years teaching everyone around him that stillness was power, and power was all there was. Smiled. It was small. It was brief. It was entirely real. And it was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened in that apartment. Because once something like that starts, it does not stop. It does not negotiate. It does not care about fortresses or debts or the calculations of men who have confused their armor for themselves. It simply grows, down in the dark, sending roots through everything. And by the time you notice, it has already changed you. That is how it always works, with the things that matter. That is how it always works. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been placed in a situation you did not create, forced to carry the consequences of someone else's choices, and still found a way to walk through it without losing yourself? Have you ever looked at someone the world told you to fear and chosen to see the wound beneath the armor instead? And have you ever been the person in the locked room, the one kept away from the truth about their own life? who finally decided that silence was no longer something they were willing to offer for free. Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, redemption, and the kind of love that finds you in the last place you would ever think to look, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.